So today, I'm going to start a 2-weeker on shame this week and next week. It's an interesting topic, and I feel like it's relevant in the world today as to what is shame? Is it good? Is it bad? This kind of stuff. But today, I'm focusing really on the idea of shame in the form of the terror we feel of being found out. What is it that we're ashamed of, that we're just dreadfully afraid of somebody finding out? And I'm drawing on a story from a book I read a few years ago, and it's a book about people who were publicly shamed. They had done something, and it comes out, uh-oh, what happens? And this story involves, basically, we have two main characters. We have Michael and we have Jonah. And they're both journalists. And what happens is, well, Jonah's a successful writer and Michael not so much, but he's got himself a job and he's looking for a story. And he's searching around, trying to figure out, well, what is it that I need to write about? And this guy Jonah's been in the news a little bit lately, so he sees that Jonah has a book out called Imagine. Let's see, it was called Imagine. Doesn't really matter. But How Creativity Works, that's what it was. How Creativity Works. And so what ends up happening is he decides, well, I'm going to buy this book. It's a #1 seller on the New York Best Times selling list. So he acquires it. And he starts reading it, and he's particularly interested in this book because the very first chapter of the book is titled Bob Dylan's Brain. And Michael is a real Bob Dylan superfan. This is one of those guys who's read every Bob Dylan article, he's seen every Bob Dylan interview, he's heard every song that Bob Dylan ever wrote. And so he's like, wow, okay, this is going to be interesting. But what happens is he starts reading the book, and he gets to this point where it's May of 1965 in Bob Dylan's life, and Bob Dylan's struggling. He's having trouble coming up with new music. And he says to his manager that he's thinking about quitting. He says, maybe I'm going to just stop writing altogether. But the book says, but then, just when Dylan was most determined to stop creating music, he was overcome with a strange feeling. It's a hard thing to describe, Dylan would later remember. It's just this sense that you've got something to say. There was that, and it was kind of a powerful quote. If you're struggling to write something and say something, to have Bob Dylan, this world famous musician, in a place where he's ready to give it up, coming around saying, no, I've got something to say, it inspired people. But Michael, who knew all the Bob Dylan story, says, well, when did Bob Dylan say that? I don't recall ever hearing him say that. He starts reading more of this book. And apparently Bob Dylan had this thing of seeing, when he saw himself in the news, he would say, oh, thank God that's not me. Ha ha ha. Thank God I'm not that. And so he has this double quote, and Michael again raises a red flag saying, I don't think that's anything Bob Dylan ever said. He said the first half, but not the second. So he keeps reading, and he finds about 4 or 5 other quotes that he goes, these don't make sense to me. So he actually decides to be a reasonable human being and contacts Jonah. And he says, Jonah, really enjoyed your book. Hey, just wondering, where did you get these references? Where did these quotes come from? And Jonah says, well, there's this big anthology of all of Bob Dylan work, so I got some from there. But I also had help from Bob's manager, Jeff Rosen. Okay, well, see, when a lot of these Bob Dylan things were written was back in the 60s and 70s, and you actually had to like get a book and read them and then transcribe them over. But by the time this story had come out, and this book was released, it was 2012, and things had changed in the world. Apparently, a bunch of internet super fans had all gathered Bob Dylan's work, compiled it together, and it was all available in one giant electronic database that was available for free online, no problem. So what Jonah hadn't accounted for was that A, Michael cared as much as he did and was tenacious, but he also didn't account for the fact that it really wasn't that hard to go through this giant volume of material. And so Michael was very easily able to go through and search and find out that Bob Dylan never actually said 6 of the different things that he was supposedly said according to Jonah. Well, things start to get escalated because Michael's throwing back, well, hey, I went through the database and I didn't see anything that makes us. And Jonah says, well, but I did get help from the manager. Well, Bob Dylan only had one manager, and Michael had contacted him as well. And the manager said, I've never spoken to Jonah. So when Michael lays all this on to the author, Jonah, things change dramatically because Jonah has been found out. What happens is that the flow of communication used to be Michael trying to get to Jonah, and now it switches. Jonah's calling Michael, are you going to publish it? Are you going to publish it? Are you going to tell him? And he shows all these calls. He's like, it borderlines on harassment. What changed here? What changed here? It's this terror of being found out, right? Jonah was quite content having tucked all this stuff aside. I've got a nice book. It's making money. Great, good for me. But now he's ashamed because his secret is in Michael's hands. And I think this is actually how a lot of us operate, in a sense that we have something hidden off from the side that we're secretly ashamed of. We go, oh, yeah, I look like a functional human being. I seem like I get along with people. As long as people don't find out about that, there's something that we all have, I think, that is, at least in our eyes, horrendous. It may not actually be that bad. I have revealed secrets to my wife over the years and go, oh, well, you don't really care nearly much about that as I did. But for the most part, we're not willing to take that risk to put that private stuff out publicly. This is why my idea of having church like a CrossFit gym where you have labels as to what it is you're working on spiritually and you mark yourself as far as improvement. That idea would never work because nobody wants to say, well, I'm having trouble with looking at pornography. I'm having trouble with drugs. Nobody wants to put those stuff on a wall and come back every week and say, oh, great, you did less lines of coke last week than this one. Well done, good job. That's not really going to be something we want to admit because that's the stuff that's over there, right? So we have this relationship with shame where we know that there are things that we're not proud about and we don't want it to come forward. And yet the Lord tells us very clearly in the Gospels that eventually it's all going to come forward. In the Gospel of Luke, he says, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees. What's the yeast of the Pharisees? Which is hypocrisy, right? You say one thing, you do another. Oh, that's what Jonah's doing. He's saying, I've got these quotes when he really doesn't. He says, there is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What you have said in the dark will be heard in the daylight, and what you have whispered in the ear in the inner rooms will be proclaimed from the roofs. Uh-oh, there are no secrets. No secrets. Scary, terrifying. It's the terror of being found out. Oh no. Oh no, what do you do in that situation? Well, the Lord's telling us this, that way we stop doing those things that aren't proud of, that we don't have that stuff in our closet. And he's telling us that, okay, you may have done some things that are over there, but the fact that you're not that person today, everything's good. Your past isn't shouted from the rooftops. It's who you are that's shouted from the rooftops. So you don't have to feel ashamed of things you've done previously that you're not doing currently. But there is a use to shame. And I think it's useful to understanding that, well, the shame is supposed to, turn us away from those activities. And when we look a little deeper into what the Word says about shame and its use and what it comes from, I think we learn a little bit more. Now, those of you who have been reading the Bible all your life might know where the first instance of shame comes from. It comes from Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve. Because Genesis 2 says, the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. Okay, so we start off not being shameful. But it doesn't take very long, right? The serpent comes into play, and he tempts them with the fruit. They eat of the fruit. And Genesis 3:7 says, then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. Uh-oh, that means now we are ashamed. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. Well, as you might expect, Swedenborg's very helpful in this story and gives us a deeper meaning as to what this is all about. And Secrets of Heaven 2:13, you'll see, it says, by knowing that they were naked, is signified their knowing and acknowledging themselves to no longer be in innocence as before, but in evil, as is evident from the last verse of the preceding chapter, where it is said, and they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. And where it may be seen that not to be ashamed because they were naked signifies to be innocent. The contrary is signified by being ashamed, as in this verse where it is said, they sewed fig leaves together and hid themselves. For where there is no innocence, nakedness is a scandal and a disgrace, because it is attended with a consciousness of thinking evil. Oh, okay. So what's going on here? Nakedness is a scandal and disgrace because it's consciousness of thinking evil. Well, you have to kind of understand it in terms of, this is how I understand it, is you can be naked and not be lustful, right? When you're a little kid and you're 5 years old and you're playing in the pool with your friends and you're all naked, nobody's thinking any thoughts of lust, sexual stuff. It's just, you're playing in the pool. It's all good. But as we get older and our lives change, we change, suddenly it's much more difficult to be naked and not have other thoughts come to mind. This is why they have nude beaches, but they require a man to show up with a woman so that he's not just going there to be a pervert, right? That's because, well, we go and we're naked and we have attending evil thoughts that go with it. But this idea of innocence and shame isn't tied just to physical nakedness. It's saying how, well, you bring something else there with it. And Secrets of Heaven 2:14 tells us what is being brought. It says, they are called naked because left to their own. Okay, notice there's a capital O in that. It's their own. It's like their sense of self. It's me as an autonomous individual who has their own way to harvest their destiny, right? Because left to their own, for they who are left to their own, that is, to themselves, have no longer anything of intelligence and wisdom or of faith. Why is it? Because it's saying we have left the Lord behind. We say, I don't need you, Lord. I've got the magic fruit. I don't need you to be in the garden anymore. I've got it under control. I have knowledge of good and evil. Thank you very much. I'm on my own. I've got this. Thank you very much. This is where shame comes into play. Because we think we're all of our own, but then what happens in the story is it's the voice, they hear the Lord walking in the garden, and they go, oh no, he now knows that we've left him. He now knows we've done something we weren't supposed to do. He now knows. What are they terrified of? Of being found out. Let's quick put some leaves and vines around us, cover us up. That way, he won't see what we've done. Of course, that very act reveals that they've done something, right? Because he's like, well, who told you you were naked? The serpent did. But, right? It's this terror of being found out that motivates us and pushes us so many times. And what the Lord's telling us is that shame is actually a useful tool, right? It's a useful tool to say, oh yeah, this activity that you're ashamed of, hey, that's great. I'm glad you're ashamed of that. There are some things that you should be ashamed of. There are some things that you should say, boy, I'm not my finest moment. I wish I didn't think these things. I wish I didn't do these things. I wish I didn't want to do these things. It's shameful that I do these things, bringing disgrace on my family and all that kind of stuff, right? There are things to be ashamed about. And it's a tool the Lord's saying, okay, I want you to feel that way so that you don't do it anymore, so that when you move on to the next life, well, what happens? You associate with good people because you don't do those things. We've talked about before the stories of George Ritchie and his near-death experience. And when he has this tour of the afterlife, he recounts a similar thing to Swedenborg about how like attracts like. But he puts it in a way that I really appreciate because he sees what happens to these wounded souls who do these terrible things is like, they go to be with one another because, in essence, when they're with people like themselves, there is no shame, right? If you like doing drugs, well, who do you hang out with? Well, other people who do that because there's no shame in doing that around those people. But you don't show up with your bong to church, right? Because, well, that would not look very good on you. Same kind of thing with all the other kind of shameful behaviors, right? You don't show up at church with your Playboy magazine thumbing through it, right? Oh, that would be shameful. Can you imagine doing that? No, you don't do that. You do that over there with other people who are into that stuff. So shame has this goal of amending our behavior. And eventually it can in this world if we let it. But Swedenborg gives us a warning that shame in and of itself isn't necessarily enough. If we don't take care of the stuff now, shame will not prevent us from making the change. Much like George Ritchie was saying, oh yeah, these people all go be like themselves, with people who are like themselves. Swedenborg gives us a story in TCR number 80 that we'll read now. And he shows that, well, shame isn't going to be the only thing that motivates us. Swedenborg's talking with some devils, and he says, I then asked what he and his companions believed about heaven and hell. He replied with a loud laugh, what is heaven but the ethereal firmament above? And what are its angels but spots wandering about the sun? And what are the archangels but comets with long tails upon which a crowd of them dwell? And what is hell but bogs where in their imagination frogs and crocodiles are the devils? Everything beyond these ideas of heaven and hell is mere trumpery brought forth by some prelate for the purpose of winning glory from the ignorant multitude. So they don't believe that there's an afterlife, yet they're in it, right? All of this he said precisely as he had thought upon these subjects in the world, not knowing that he was then living after death and having forgotten all that he had heard when he first entered the spiritual world. So again he replied to a question about life after death that it was the thing of the imagination, and that perchance some effluvium arising from a buried corpse in the shape of a man, or a thing called a ghost, about which some tell stories, had introduced such a notion among men's fancies. When I heard this, I could no longer keep from laughing, and I said, "Satan, you are raving mad! What are you now? Are you not in the form of a man? Do you not talk, see, hear, walk? Recall to mind that you have lived in another world which you have forgotten, and that you are now living after death, and that you are even now just talking just as you formerly did." And the recollection was given him, and he remembered, and was ashamed. And he cried out, "I am mad! I saw heaven above, and I heard angels there uttering things ineffable. But that was when I first came here. I will now keep this in mind to tell my companions from whom I came, and perhaps they too will be as ashamed as I am." And he kept repeating that he would call them madman. But as he descended, forgetfulness expelled remembrance. And when he reached his companions, he was as mad as they, and said that what he had heard from me was madness. In this way do Satans think and talk after death. Those are called Satans who have confirmed in themselves falsities until they believe them, and those are called devils who have confirmed in themselves their evils by their life. So shame in this case is not enough to change somebody who's already confirmed in the behavior. But what we're seeing here is that shame is enough to perhaps change you when you know you should change in the first place. Like it's kind of related to conscience. Like, oh, okay, I know I shouldn't be doing this. I'm going to stop doing this because it's shameful. But if you're already committed to the action, we're seeing that shame may not be enough to change you. The whole point here is to see that we often have this thing that we're afraid of being found out about. And the Lord's saying, that's good that you have those things. Make sure that you work on those things now and in this life, because you can change them. In the end, Michael did publish the story about Jonah. He published it because he felt he was stuck in a position that he could not otherwise do it. As much as Jonah was concerned about what would happen if Michael published it, because he says, I'm not going to just lose a job. I'm going to lose my vocation. Who's going to trust him as a journalist after that? But in Michael's digging up of this story, what ends up happening is he had talked to other journalists about how to find out information, learn about the story. And now these other journalists knew the conclusion. They knew what Jonah had done as well. So if Michael doesn't publish, he feels, well, I'm an accomplice. I'm perpetuating the fraud as much as Jonah. And Michael admitted, he had this sense of needing to have justice and honor and integrity in journalism and all those kind of things as well. So with a heavy heart, he published it. To this day, Jonah really hasn't found his footing in the journalistic world since. He's published apologies, he said he's sorry, but people don't really take him seriously as being sorry. They say, well, you know what? The reality was when Michael first started digging up on Jonah, this wasn't the only thing going on. He was in the news for other questionable journalistic things as well. And so adding this onto it was just compounding a problem that was already there. So there was too much for him to kind of recover or continue his career as it was. He resigned from one job, then he got another one. He got fired from that because more and more stuff kept coming out. Will this guy, Jonah, really learn the lesson? Well, hope so. I hope so. It's not really for us to know, I suppose, truly. But the point the Lord's saying is, yeah, that shame hopefully has driven him out of that behavior. So in the next life he wakes up, and that's not who he is. And therefore, when he goes to hang out with his friends are just like himself, good, honorable, and just. Amen.